In the spring of 1945, as American and Soviet forces converged on the dying Nazi regime from opposite directions, one of America's most controversial and outspoken generals began advocating for something that seemed unthinkable. General George S. Patton, fresh from leading the Third Army in its spectacular drive across France and into Germany, started arguing that the Allies should immediately turn their weapons against their Soviet allies. Not after the war ended, not after Germany surrendered, but immediately, while Allied armies were still in position and at full strength. Patton wanted to attack the Soviet Union, and he wanted to do it before the Germans had even been defeated. This proposal, which Patton would continue to advocate until his death in December 1945, was rejected by Supreme Allied Commander Dwight Eisenhower and by the American political leadership. But was Patton right? Was he a visionary who saw the Cold War coming before anyone else? Or was he a dangerous warmonger whose reckless proposals could have led to catastrophe? The story of Patton's advocacy for war with the Soviets reveals deep tensions within the Allied coalition and raises profound questions about the immediate post-war period. To understand why Patton wanted to attack the Soviets, we need to understand what he was seeing on the ground in Germany in the spring of 1945. As the Third Army advanced eastward, Patton's forces were encountering evidence of Soviet behavior that disturbed him profoundly. Refugees were flooding westward from areas occupied by the Red Army, telling stories of rape, murder, and wholesale looting by Soviet soldiers. German civilians, who had been taught to fear the Bolshevik menace, were terrified of falling under Soviet control and were desperately trying to reach American or British lines. Patton, visiting newly liberated areas and concentration camps, was confronted with the full horror of Nazi crimes. But he was simultaneously becoming aware of Soviet actions that he found almost equally disturbing. Patton's background and personality made him particularly receptive to anti-Soviet views. He was a conservative, an anti-communist, and someone who had never trusted the Soviet alliance. He had opposed cooperation with the Soviets from the beginning, viewing them as barbaric and treacherous. His views were shaped by his own prejudices, by reports from his intelligence officers, and by what he personally witnessed. He saw Soviet soldiers as undisciplined and brutal. He saw Soviet political officers as sinister commissars imposing totalitarian control. And he saw in the Soviet occupation of Eastern Europe the replacement of one tyranny with another. By April 1945, as American and Soviet forces made contact along the Elbe River, Patton was becoming increasingly vocal in his anti-Soviet views. He argued in meetings with other American commanders that the Soviet Union represented a long-term threat to the United States and to Western civilization. He believed that the Red Army, despite having been an ally against Hitler, was fundamentally hostile to American interests, and he began to propose what many considered a radical and dangerous course of action. The United States, he argued, should keep its armies in Europe at full strength, should rearm German prisoners of war, and should launch an immediate offensive against Soviet forces in Eastern Europe before they had time to consolidate their positions. Patton's proposal was not a casual suggestion made in the heat of the moment. He advocated for it repeatedly, in various forms, to anyone who would listen. He raised it with Eisenhower, with visiting politicians and journalists, and with his own staff officers. His argument had several components. First, he believed that the Soviet Union intended to dominate all of Europe and that Stalin's promises about free elections in Eastern Europe were worthless. Second, he argued that the Western Allies had a window of opportunity while their armies were mobilized and in position, a window that would close once demobilization began. Third, he proposed using German forces, particularly the remnants of the Wehrmacht, as auxiliaries in this fight, arguing that the Germans hated and feared the Soviets and would fight alongside the Americans, if given the chance. The specifics of what Patton advocated varied somewhat, depending on when and to whom he was speaking, but the core idea remained consistent. He wanted to attack Soviet forces, drive them out of Eastern Europe, liberate the territories they had occupied, and establish a post-war order in which Soviet power was contained or destroyed. Some versions of his proposal involved a limited war to push Soviet forces back behind their pre-war borders. Other versions suggested a more ambitious campaign to destroy Soviet military power entirely, and perhaps even overthrow Stalin's regime. In all versions, Patton's plan required using Allied military superiority immediately, before the United States demobilized and before the Soviets could consolidate their control over occupied territories. Patton's proposals were based on several assumptions about military capabilities. He believed that American and British forces, with their superior training, equipment, and logistics, could defeat the Red Army in a direct confrontation. He noted that Soviet forces, while numerous, were exhausted from 4 years of brutal warfare against Germany. He observed that Soviet supply lines were stretched thin and that the Red Army's equipment, while adequate, was inferior to American materiel in many respects. He also believed that the American monopoly on atomic weapons, though the bomb had not yet been used and its full potential was not yet proven, would give the United States a decisive advantage in any conflict with the Soviets. However, Patton's analysis contained significant flaws and blind spots. He consistently underestimated Soviet military capabilities and overestimated American advantages. The Red Army in 1945 was not the disorganized force that had struggled in the Winter War against Finland in 1939. It was a battle-hardened, experienced army that had defeated the Wehrmacht through 4 years of the most brutal fighting in military history. Soviet commanders had learned their craft in the hardest school imaginable. Soviet tactics and operational art had evolved dramatically since 1941, and Soviet forces, while exhausted, were also victorious, confident, and positioned deep in Central Europe, with supply lines running back to Soviet industrial centers that had survived the war intact. Patton also failed to adequately consider the political dimensions of what he was proposing. The American public in 1945 wanted the war to end, wanted their sons and husbands to come home, and had no appetite for a new war against a country that had been portrayed as a heroic ally throughout the war. President Roosevelt, until his death in April 1945, and then President Truman were committed to the alliance with the Soviet Union and to the framework established at the Tehran and Yalta conferences for post-war cooperation. The idea of immediately turning against the Soviets was politically impossible. Congress would never have supported it. The American people would have been outraged, and Britain, exhausted and nearly bankrupt after 6 years of war, would never have agreed to participate. Eisenhower's response to Patton's proposals was firmly negative. Eisenhower, as Supreme Allied Commander, had spent years managing the difficult alliance between the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union. He understood the political constraints under which he operated. He knew that his mission was to defeat Nazi Germany, not to start a new war with the Soviet Union. When Patton raised his proposals, Eisenhower rejected them immediately and told Patton in no uncertain terms to stop making such suggestions. Eisenhower was not naive about Soviet intentions. He had his own concerns about Soviet behavior and Soviet post-war plans. But he believed that those concerns had to be addressed through diplomacy and political pressure, not through military action. The tension between Patton and Eisenhower over this issue was part of a longer-standing, complicated relationship. Eisenhower recognized Patton's brilliance as a battlefield commander, but was frequently exasperated by his indiscipline, his tendency to speak without thinking, and his political tone-deafness. Eisenhower had already had to reprimand Patton multiple times during the war for various infractions, including the infamous incident in Sicily, where Patton slapped 2 soldiers suffering from combat fatigue. The proposal to attack the Soviets was another example of Patton going far beyond his authority and speaking publicly about matters of grand strategy that were not his to decide. Other American commanders had varied reactions to Patton's views. Some shared his concerns about Soviet intentions, but disagreed with his proposed solution. General Omar Bradley, Patton's superior and former subordinate, thought Patton's anti-Soviet rhetoric was dangerous and unhelpful. General Courtney Hodges, commander of the First Army, focused on completing the mission against Germany and avoided engagement with Patton's more provocative suggestions. British commanders, including Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery, were aware of Patton's views, but generally dismissed them as the ravings of an unstable glory seeker. Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, actually shared some of Patton's concerns about Soviet intentions, but even Churchill recognized that immediate military action against the Soviets was impossible. As the war in Europe moved toward its conclusion, Patton's frustration grew. He watched as political decisions were made that he believed betrayed Western interests. The decision to halt American forces at the Elbe River and allow Soviet forces to capture Berlin particularly infuriated him. Patton believed that American forces should have raced for Berlin, should have captured the German capital before the Soviets arrived, and should have used control of Berlin as leverage in post-war negotiations. Eisenhower's decision to halt at the Elbe, made for both military and political reasons, seemed to Patton like a disastrous capitulation to Soviet demands. The division of Germany into occupation zones, agreed upon at Yalta and implemented after Germany's surrender, also angered Patton. American forces had advanced well beyond the agreed-upon boundaries of the American occupation zone. Under the terms of the Yalta Agreement, these forces would have to withdraw, turning over territory to Soviet control. Patton argued vehemently against this withdrawal. He wanted American forces to stay where they were, to refuse to hand over territory to the Soviets, and to use military presence as a bargaining chip. When he was overruled and ordered to withdraw American forces to the agreed-upon occupation zone boundaries, Patton complied, but made his unhappiness clear in numerous statements to journalists and politicians. After Germany's surrender on May 8, 1945, Patton's anti-Soviet advocacy became even more intense and more public. No longer constrained by the need to maintain the wartime alliance, Patton spoke more freely about his views. In meetings with visiting congressmen, in interviews with journalists, and in his diary and private correspondence, Patton argued that the United States had won the war against Germany, only to lose the peace to the Soviet Union. He described the Soviets as the new enemy, as a threat equal to or greater than Nazi Germany had been. And he continued to argue, though now more as a theoretical proposition than as an immediate proposal, that the United States should have fought the Soviets while it had the chance. Patton also became involved in controversies over denazification policies in the American occupation zone. He was assigned as military governor of Bavaria after the war, responsible for administering the occupation and implementing policies to remove former Nazis from positions of authority. Patton, focused on what he saw as the Soviet threat, thought these denazification policies were misguided. He argued that Germany needed to be rebuilt quickly as a bulwark against Soviet expansion, and that obsessing over former Nazi Party membership was counterproductive. He made comments suggesting that Nazi Party membership was no more significant than Democratic or Republican Party membership in the United States, comments that caused a scandal when reported in the press. These comments led to Patton's removal as military governor of Bavaria. Eisenhower, under pressure from Washington and from public opinion, outraged by Patton's apparent sympathy for Nazis, relieved Patton of his position in October 1945 and reassigned him to command of the 15th Army, a largely paper organization tasked with compiling historical records of the war. This was effectively a demotion and a clear signal that Patton's career was ending in disgrace. Patton, bitter and angry, continued to speak out about what he saw as the betrayal of American interests and the failure to confront the Soviet threat. On December 9, 1945, Patton was critically injured in a car accident near Mannheim, Germany. His staff car collided with an American Army truck, and Patton suffered a broken neck that left him paralyzed. He died 12 days later on December 21, 1945, without ever regaining the ability to walk. His death came before the full onset of the Cold War, before the Berlin blockade, before the fall of Czechoslovakia and the complete Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, and before the Korean War. Patton died, believing that he had been right about the Soviet threat, but that his warnings had been ignored, that America had won the war but was losing the peace, and that history would vindicate his views. The question of whether Patton was right about the Soviet threat is complex. In one sense, he was clearly correct that the Soviet Union posed a long-term challenge to American interests. Stalin had no intention of allowing free elections in Eastern Europe. The Soviet occupation of Eastern European countries led to the establishment of communist regimes and the creation of the Iron Curtain that would divide Europe for 45 years. The Cold War that Patton predicted did indeed occur, consuming enormous resources and bringing the world to the brink of nuclear annihilation on several occasions. Patton saw this coming before most American leaders were willing to acknowledge it. However, being right about the nature of the Soviet threat does not mean Patton was right about the solution. His proposal to attack the Soviet Union in 1945 was militarily risky, politically impossible, and morally questionable. A war between the United States and the Soviet Union in 1945 would have been catastrophic. The Red Army, despite Patton's dismissive assessment, was a formidable force that had just defeated the Wehrmacht. Soviet forces outnumbered Western Allied forces in Europe significantly. While American forces had advantages in equipment and logistics, those advantages were not decisive enough to guarantee victory in a continental war against the Soviets. The military realities of such a conflict would have been grim. The Red Army in 1945 numbered over 11 million men under arms. American and British forces in Europe, even before demobilization began, numbered fewer than 4 million combined. Soviet forces were battle-hardened, motivated by years of fighting for survival against Germany, and commanded by experienced officers who had learned to conduct large-scale armored operations. American forces, while well-equipped and well-trained, were exhausted from their own campaigns and were expecting to go home, not to start a new war. The logistical challenges of sustaining an offensive deep into Eastern Europe or into Soviet territory would have been immense. Patton's suggestion to rearm German prisoners of war and use them as auxiliaries in a war against the Soviets was particularly problematic. German forces had just been defeated after a war in which they committed unprecedented atrocities. The idea of rearming them and using them to fight the Soviets, only months after VE Day, would have been politically explosive and morally indefensible. How could the United States justify fighting alongside forces that had recently operated concentration camps, conducted the Holocaust, and devastated Europe? The propaganda value to the Soviets would have been enormous, allowing Stalin to portray the conflict as a continuation of the war against fascism with the United States, now allied with the Nazis. The atomic bomb, which Patton thought would give the United States a decisive advantage, was not the war-winning weapon in 1945 that it might seem in retrospect. In August 1945, the United States possessed exactly 2 atomic bombs, the 2 that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. Production of additional bombs was slow. It would be months before more bombs became available. The effect of atomic weapons on Soviet forces dispersed across the vast spaces of Eastern Europe and the Soviet Union was uncertain, and the moral and political consequences of using atomic weapons against an ally, even a former ally, would have been incalculable. The precedent would have normalized nuclear warfare in a way that might have led to catastrophic consequences later. The political impossibility of Patton's proposal cannot be overstated. President Truman, who had just assumed office after Roosevelt's death, was committed to the United Nations framework and to post-war cooperation with the Soviet Union. The American public had been told throughout the war that the Soviet Union was a heroic ally. Suddenly, attacking the Soviets would have required a massive propaganda effort to reverse years of pro-Soviet messaging. Congress, which would have to declare war, would never have supported such a move. Britain, America's closest ally, was exhausted and desperate for peace. Churchill might have been sympathetic to confronting Soviet power, but the British public and the British military were in no condition to fight another major war. The consequences of a war between the Western Allies and the Soviet Union in 1945 are difficult to calculate, but would likely have been devastating. Even if American and British forces had achieved initial successes, pushing Soviet forces back from their advanced positions in Central Europe, a sustained conflict would have required fighting deep into Eastern Europe and potentially into Soviet territory. The Soviet Union's vast spaces, large population, and willingness to accept enormous casualties would have made such a campaign extremely difficult. The war could have lasted years, consumed millions of lives, and potentially ended with the use of atomic weapons on a scale that would have made Hiroshima and Nagasaki look restrained by comparison. There is also the question of what such a war would have been fighting for. Patton spoke about confronting Soviet power and liberating Eastern Europe, but what would post-war arrangements have looked like if the Western Allies had defeated the Soviet Union? Would the United States have occupied Russia? would there have been an attempt to overthrow Stalin's government and install a democratic regime? The occupation of Germany and Japan, relatively small and defeated countries, was already stretching Allied resources. The idea of occupying and attempting to democratize the Soviet Union was fantastical. Yet despite all these arguments against Patton's proposal, his core insight about Soviet intentions was correct. Stalin had no intention of withdrawing from Eastern Europe. The agreements reached at Yalta about free elections were violated almost immediately. The Soviet occupation of Eastern European countries led to the suppression of democracy, the establishment of communist dictatorships, and the suffering of millions of people under totalitarian regimes. The Iron Curtain that descended across Europe created a division that would last until 1989. The Cold War that Patton predicted consumed enormous resources and several times brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Eisenhower's refusal to hear Patton's warning was based on practical, political, and moral considerations that were entirely valid in 1945. But it is also true that the post-war settlement in Europe, particularly the division of Germany and the Soviet domination of Eastern Europe, created problems that would plague the West for decades. The question is whether there was any alternative that could have prevented Soviet control of Eastern Europe without starting an immediate war. Some historians argue that firmer diplomatic pressure, a slower demobilization of Western forces, and a more skeptical approach to Soviet promises might have limited Soviet expansion without requiring military action. Others argue that Stalin's determination to secure a buffer zone in Eastern Europe meant that, short of war, there was no way to prevent Soviet domination of the region. Churchill famously delivered his Iron Curtain speech in March 1946, just months after Patton's death, warning of Soviet expansion and calling for Western unity against the communist threat. Churchill's speech is often seen as marking the beginning of the Cold War's ideological phase. But Churchill, unlike Patton, was not calling for immediate military action against the Soviets. He was calling for diplomatic and political measures to contain Soviet power, for Western unity, and for a position of strength from which to negotiate with Stalin. This approach, eventually formalized as the policy of containment, became the foundation of American Cold War strategy. Patton's advocacy for attacking the Soviets can be seen as an early, crude version of the arguments that would later be made by Cold War hawks. His insight that the Soviet Union was not truly an ally, but rather a temporary partner against a common enemy, was correct. His prediction that Soviet expansion would create long-term problems for the West was accurate. But his proposed solution, immediate military action, was impractical and potentially catastrophic. The containment policy that eventually emerged, while imperfect and costly, at least avoided a direct military confrontation that could have led to the use of nuclear weapons and potentially to human extinction. There is also a counterfactual question worth considering. If the Western Allies had followed Patton's advice and attacked the Soviets in 1945, and if such a war had gone badly, what would the consequences have been? A Soviet victory in such a conflict could have led to Soviet domination not just of Eastern Europe, but of all of Europe. American forces might have been driven from the continent entirely. The use of atomic weapons by the United States might have been ineffective, or might have provoked Soviet retaliation through conventional means that overwhelmed remaining Western forces. The post-war world could have been far worse than the Cold War division that actually occurred. Patton's personal characteristics also played a role in how his proposals were received. He was known for impulsive statements, for speaking before thinking, and for advocating extreme positions. His credibility was damaged by previous incidents, including the slapping incident in Sicily and his problematic statements about denazification. When someone with Patton's reputation for recklessness and poor judgment advocates for starting a war with a former ally, it's easy for decision-makers to dismiss the proposal even if there are valid concerns underlying it. A more measured diplomatic figure making similar arguments might have been taken more seriously, though likely still rejected. The broader lesson from Patton's advocacy for war with the Soviets is about the difficulty of transitioning from wartime alliance to post-war competition. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union were always uneasy allies, united only by their common enemy in Nazi Germany. Once that enemy was defeated, the underlying tensions and contradictions in the alliance quickly surfaced. How to manage this transition, how to shift from cooperation to competition without either surrendering vital interests or starting a new catastrophic war, was the challenge facing Western leaders in 1945. They chose a path of attempting continued cooperation while preparing for potential conflict, a path that eventually evolved into the Cold War strategy of containment. Patton died before he could see how the Cold War developed, before he could see whether his predictions about Soviet behavior were vindicated. In the decades after his death, Patton became a controversial figure, admired by some as a visionary who saw the Soviet threat early and advocated for confronting it, criticized by others as a dangerous warmonger whose proposals could have led to disaster. His reputation has been shaped by books, films, and political debates about the Cold War and about American foreign policy. Different generations and different political perspectives have found different lessons in Patton's advocacy for war with the Soviets. For some, Patton represents the road not taken, the opportunity missed to confront Soviet power, when the West had advantages in military technology and before the Soviets developed atomic weapons. This view suggests that Patton was right, that Eisenhower and Truman made a mistake by not listening to him, and that the Cold War could have been avoided or won more decisively if the West had acted in 1945. This interpretation has been popular among conservative critics of containment policy, who believe the Cold War was fought too defensively and should have been won more aggressively. For others, Patton represents the danger of military leaders who fail to understand political realities and who advocate for military solutions to problems that require diplomatic and political approaches. This view sees Patton's proposals as reckless, naive about the realities of warfare against the Soviet Union, and ignorant of the political impossibilities he was suggesting. This interpretation has been popular among those who believe the Cold War was managed appropriately through containment and that Patton's proposals would have led to catastrophe. The truth probably lies somewhere between these extremes. Patton was correct that the Soviet Union would become a long-term adversary and that Soviet control of Eastern Europe would create lasting problems. His insight was valuable, and his warnings deserved to be taken seriously. However, his proposed solution was impractical, politically impossible, and potentially catastrophic. The challenge facing Western leaders in 1945 was to acknowledge the threat Patton identified while finding a response that was both effective and realistic. The containment policy that eventually emerged was an attempt to do exactly that, to confront Soviet power without starting World War III. Eisenhower's decision to refuse Patton's proposals was the right decision given the constraints and realities of 1945. But Eisenhower and other Western leaders could perhaps have been more skeptical of Soviet promises, firmer in their diplomatic negotiations, and more cautious about demobilizing too quickly. The challenge was to find a middle ground between Patton's reckless advocacy for immediate war and naive trust in Soviet good faith. That middle ground was difficult to find and took several years to establish, during which time the Soviet grip on Eastern Europe tightened and became permanent. The story of Patton's advocacy for war with the Soviets and Eisenhower's refusal to hear it is ultimately a story about the difficulty of grand strategy, about the tension between military and political considerations, and about how nations transition from alliance to rivalry. It raises questions that remain relevant today about when to confront rising powers, how to manage relationships with countries that are simultaneously partners and competitors, and how to balance idealistic goals with practical constraints. Patton and Eisenhower represented two different approaches to these questions, and history has judged them both, finding wisdom and folly in each of their positions.